Welcome, everybody. Good morning, Utah. Welcome to another edition of NAIOP Live. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Josh Caldwell with Mortensen Salt Lake City and with NAIOP Utah Board. And I'm excited this morning to have this conversation with you guys about federal legislative priorities. And I know the rest of you are probably thinking just the same way I am, that there's nothing sexier really than federal legislative priorities. And so super excited to be having this conversation about what those are, how the new administration looks at the commercial real estate landscape, how that specifically impacts the Utah commercial real estate. And we're lucky enough to have a government federal legislative expert from corporate NAIOP with us to have that conversation today. But before we get into that, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. As always, this is meant to be an interactive, free-flowing conversation with you, our audience. So please feel free to comment, ask questions, criticize anybody except me in the chat feature or the Q&A. I'll do my best to pin down Aquiles, who is our guest today, and get you the answers that you're seeking. And want to make sure that everybody sticks around, because at the end of the day today, at the end of today's discussion, I should say, there will be a giveaway. So if you tuned in and you're able to stick through till the end, I promise you it will be well worth the shot at what's being given away today. Real quick shout out to all of our chapter sponsors. Platinum, of course, thank you to Zions Bank for being our platinum sponsor. CBRE, Big D Construction, Colliers and Mortensen, thank you for being our silver level sponsors. And Harris Company, Ballard Spar, Salt Lake City Global Logistics Center, Price Real Estate, and Hamilton Partners, thank you so much for being our bronze level sponsors. And for today's event sponsor, a huge shout out to FFKR for sponsoring and for providing the giveaway gift. So like I said, make sure that you're tuned in. You do have to be present to win, and you're definitely going to want to win. Jade, I'm curious how I can get my name into that hat for consideration, but don't worry about that as much as give us a little bit of insight. Talk to us about FFKR before we get started today.
Hello, everyone. Josh, thank you so much for that introduction. I don't know. I think things may get a little savage if the presenter wins the prize, the moderator wins the prize. So maybe we get you something on the side. Anyways, I work for FFKR, and I am so pleased to be here. I'm also, that is my day job. I'm also a board member for NAIOP Utah, and I get to work very closely with a lot of talented board members, including Josh and Lindsay. So just happy to be here. A little bit about our firm. We are Utah's largest firm. We're about 180 plus people now, and last I checked, we had the most amount of licensed architects under one roof. I think about 68 was my last count, and we get to work on some very prestigious, high-profile, high construction dollar projects. We're very, very blessed to be able to contribute to Utah and all over the country. Some of those include we are the local architect on the Convention Center Hotel, which is a very large project, if any of you have driven by lately, and that is erecting up out of the ground, and it's really going to change the skyline of Salt Lake City. We're very excited about the Salt Lake Temple, Hillcrest High School, along with a bunch of other, commercial projects as well. So I just feel so lucky to be here. I feel so lucky to work amongst the, visionaries at FFKR. I'm really just the smooth talker, and I get to watch and see these details come to life, and I am just in awe. I feel like I get to watch HGTV for a living because I'm not very creative. So anyways, I created a really great prize. I can't wait to give away at the end, and I promise it won't be Josh this time, but maybe next time.
I will legitimately give up duties right now if you can just put my name in the hat for this prize. Well, thank you, Jade. definitely thank you, FFKR. Obviously, you guys over at FFKR put your stamp on what is the identity of this town and have been involved in a lot of really cool, iconic projects for the greater Salt Lake and Utah community. So thank you guys so much for your support and being involved today. So with that, I want to shift gears and really start focusing here on what we're wanting to talk about. If we can, if I can make introductions to you all. With us today is Aquiles Suarez, and Aquiles is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for NAIOP Corporate. Really quickly, as the Vice President for Government Affairs, Aquiles oversees the association's public policy advocacy and lobbying at the federal, state, and local levels on tax, capital, and credit, energy, infrastructure, and environmental issues. He also manages the NAIOP PAC, the association's political action committee. And prior to joining NAIOP, I think a lot of the people on this call would be interested to hear, Aquiles served as the Director of Government and Industry Relations at Fannie Mae, as well as served in various positions in the executive and legislative branches of the government, and was appointed to the White House Domestic Policy Council by President George W. Bush. So Aquiles, it's an honor to have you. Thank you for being with us today. I'm excited to talk to you about all of the insight that you have. Obviously, you know, it's especially with the new administration, I think top of mind for everybody. There are a lot of questions about, you know, how does this impact the deals that we're seeing being done? What is the new administration regulations as it relates to commercial real estate, and how do those impact what we're trying to do here specifically in Utah, but also just nationwide? And so I think today it's good to hear from you, and you can give us some insight that will be unique. Really quickly, I mean, I know that you already know this as you're from NAIOP, but so everybody's on the same page, our audience really is either NAIOP membership or commercial real estate interested people. So you're going to have a lot of bankers, a lot of developers, a lot of brokers, real estate attorneys, architects, designers, engineers, contractors, you know, everybody and anybody who touches real estate deals in the built environment in Utah. And so I think, you know, going into this, as we set the stage, it's really a, what's happening in DC? What do we know about Biden's priorities and how those impact the greater national real estate landscape? And what can we learn from that will be applied here locally? So with that, it's great to have you, Aquiles. Can you maybe intro all of this and talk to us a little bit, just high level, about how federal legislation, current federal legislation, impacts the commercial real estate industry?
Sure. And first of all, thank you for having me. It's you know, the only bad thing about doing this is that I'd rather be there in person. As I mentioned to you during the week, I visited Utah and loved it, and you know, obviously great NAIOP members there. So you know, promise me that we'll do this again in person once we can.
Next year.
You like you set it up very well. I mean, there's a lot going on, and you know, before I begin, I found that in these hypersensitive times, I have to make this statement, and that is that we are a bipartisan organization, and there are going to be areas that where we're going to be working with the Biden administration. But to be honest, on the tax front, the fact of what they are. And there are a lot of proposals made by during the campaign, and we anticipate, you know, as the year progresses on the tax front, that are very concerning to commercial real estate. And so we're going to be very active on that front. And just to give you some background, you know, usually in February we have our chapter leadership and legislative retreat, and we outline what our main priorities are for the year, and they're generally pretty, you know, the broad parameters are pretty much the same, frankly. You know, tax policy, within that, different elements. Last year it was 15-year depreciation, making that permanent. The other area that we're very involved in is obviously infrastructure. And then finally, energy efficiency. And we're pretty much going to be talking about those issues this year as well. First of all, tax policy. Right. You know, there's there's a lot of push, frankly, to increase taxes on a variety of fronts. And I don't know if you want to pull up that slide that we had discussed just to show our members some of the Biden tax proposals. Now, this isn't meant to make you throw up your breakfast or anything, so I apologize in advance, but these are some of the things that we're going to be faced with going forward. During the campaign, he has, and he being President Biden, has proposed increasing the top capital gains rate to an ordinary income rate. And this is for higher income taxpayers. So essentially moving from 20 to 39.6. Elimination of like-kind exchanges is on the agenda. They want to eliminate capital gains treatment for carried interests. In other words, tax it as ordinary income. The preferential deduction for pass-throughs, that's also on the chopping block. There's been some talk about cost recovery, particularly and specifically on multifamily housing. They want to lengthen depreciation for those. Who knows whether they're going to do the same thing for leasehold improvements. And then other areas that are of particular interest to a lot of people in our industry, a lot of NAIOP members, concerning the estate tax. Again, increasing individual, the top rate, and then we all see this in the press, increasing taxes on corporations, and then maybe some, frankly, fooling around with opportunity zones that we may not be all that happy with. And so that's a long list. Josh, I don't know if there's anything specifically you want to start talking about, but again, I think there's plenty there for us to do.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, overall, most of our interest on the people in this audience, I think, are going to have, a wide variety of questions, just because we're in a transition year and because we're seeing a lot of changes proposed from this new administration. But if any of the points that you just mentioned really, I think, are probably most priority or most top of mind, it's probably, I would say, let's maybe start with the capital gains and see, can you maybe drill down in that one a little bit more and give us a little bit more insight into what that means?
Yeah. Before we go on, just to give people a sense of the context of the legislation, you've been hearing about the reconciliation process, and this is this arcane budget process that is used in the Senate essentially to avoid a filibuster. So the Democrats right now have 50 votes. They have two supposedly independent senators, but they really are Democrats. So they have 50 in the Senate. And as most of us know, if you have a 50-50 tie in the Senate, the VP breaks a tie. And in this case, that would be Kamala Harris. And therefore, the Democrats have effective control of the Senate. But it's a very slim margin, obviously. So what they did with the COVID bill was they used the reconciliation process, avoid the 60 vote requirement for a filibuster, and just pass it with 50 plus 1, right? Which they did. That's a useful tool in order to avoid the filibuster. But when you only have 50, that means that every one Senate Democrat has an inordinate amount of power, right? And so you saw Joe Manchin basically demand certain changes that the Democrats had to accede to. So you had kind of an argument within the Democratic caucus, and they were going to roll the Republicans, right? So there's talk about using this again on various occasions. It looks like it might be something that is easy for Democrats to do, but again, I put this in context. It's not that easy because centrist Democrats, first of all, want to get reelected. Let's face it, and so there's going to be a lot of politicking in that. So having kind of laid the groundwork for the legislative challenges, right? Capital gains. You know that Republicans in the Senate are going to be opposed to capital gains tax increases on ideology. In the past, Democrats have talked about increasing capital gains more along the lines of, because we need the money or because, for whatever reason. But there was what I would characterize some apology connected to having to raise taxes. The Democrats have shifted, much like the Republicans have had shifted. the progressive caucus of the Democrats is much more vocal, clearly, but powerful. And they want to raise capital gains taxes for ideological reasons. That, you know, there's a real push to address what they see as a inequality in wealth in the U.S. So how this impacts the economy, how this might impact individual taxpayers is secondary to kind of the ideological need to get higher taxes on wealthy people. And, you know, so when you're in that debate, facts don't matter as much because it's more about belief. And so that's kind of the challenge on capital gains. Biden has in the past been more of a centrist Democrat on a lot of issues. I mean, he's always characterized himself as a liberal, but, you know, liberal back in the 70s is much different than progressive today. I think what's going to happen with capital gains is I don't think they can go from, you know, increasing capital gains on the wealthy from 20% to what he wants, 39.6. That's a doubling of the capital gains tax rate. I think even they realize, they being the White House, that you may not want to do that to the economy just as it's going forward. So I see that as an opening bid. I do think they want to raise capital gains taxes. And for folks who know how this works, and they've seen it in the past, you know what will happen is if they say that they're going to raise capital gains taxes to 28% next year, you're going to see a whole lot of transactions happen before that. And so there's going to be a revenue flush into the coffers of the government, which is not something all that bad for Democrats who are trying to figure out how to get more money to spend on their program. So that's where I think the capital gains debate will go. I think this is will be an opening bid.
Yeah, and it's, you know, as a just kind of a higher level point of bearings, I mean, I think all of these conversations obviously are fruitful. It's good to understand what that landscape looks like, but understanding too that there's regulation and there's legislation and then there's politics, and, you know, understanding that all of that is a dance that has to be played really impacts where these can go. And like you mentioned, I don't know that we've seen a slimmer margin of favor on one side of, you know, the House versus the other like we do now. So whatever happens with all of these issues, I think is going to be interesting, you know, how much that could sway one way or the other over the next couple of years. So, you know, as you know, kind of keeping that in mind as we move through some of these issues, talk to also what I think is going to be, you know, the other biggest issue, especially for people here in this audience. In fact, there are comments already about the appreciation for NAIOP making retention of a 1031 exchange a priority. Can you talk through, just give us more color and context around what that currently looks like?
Yeah, this is a big priority for us. And we've been working on it for years. Just to give, again, some context to folks on the call, you know, not a lot of what I would characterize as normal Americans, that means people not in our industry, let's just say folks not in commercial real estate, not a lot know what a 1031 is. Right? So it's not something that, you know, is going to garner a lot of political noise in terms of the populace. But for years, this has been on the cutting block of a lot of people in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, by the way. A lot of Republicans who believe in a totally neutral tax code, and, you know, that any sort of preference, if you will, or industry specific provision should be eliminated. That's never been really realistic, let's face it. But there is some push from the right. So it's not just an anti, you know, commercial real estate position that Democrats take. It's, you know, can be ideological. So, but we've had that in the past, right? And during the tax reform debate during the Trump years, that Cuts and Jobs Act, people wanted to get rid of 1031s, and we were very active in trying to protect it. And what happened was 1031s were scaled back. It used to be usable for fleets of rental cars, for literally dairy farmers would exchange herds of cows, which became very useful to us because, of course, Paul Ryan was Speaker of the House and he's from Wisconsin. So that was something that we used. So we have been, along with the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, Real Estate Roundtable, Realtors, broad real estate coalition fighting on this issue. Okay, and I say all that just to give our members some sense of comfort that, you know, there's stuff going on here. The strategy we had in the past was really, very honestly, not to make a lot of noise about 1031s because that would raise it as a target for a lot of people. And so we've worked quietly to some extent with Democratic congressmen, Democratic senators to ensure that we had support for it on both sides. And that's what we've been doing again this year. Just this week, this broad coalition that I was talking about sent a letter to the Ways and Means Committee in the House, the Senate Finance Committee Chairman, Janet Yellen, basically outlining the importance of 1031s to our industry. The good news for us is Ron Wyden is chairman of Senate Finance. Ron Wyden is wrong on a lot of our issues, but being from Oregon, that has Weyerhaeuser and a lot of forestry industries that use 1031s, he knows it. And it's not high on his agenda to get rid of 1031, right?
Yeah.
Mike Thompson from California, Democrat on Ways and Means, he's used 1031s in the past. We have a great relationship with them. They understand how important this is. And a lot of people don't know this. I certainly didn't until this whole thing started unveiling itself, but a huge percentage of 1031s have some connection to property in California, about 10, 20%, I think. And so those guys know that it might hurt their markets. So I think we have a good argument on that issue, and we're doing it. We're in there. We just need to see how this whole infrastructure bill unfolds and what they try to use to pay for it.
When you're talking about the 1031 specifically, but I suppose it's for any of these issues that are a priority for the NAIOP audience, give us an idea. Obviously, you've made it clear what the priorities are. Letters have been sent. Coalitions are being made. Are you getting any immediate feedback from not necessarily the opposition, but just from the legislators at large, as far as, put on your gloves and your hat and look at your crystal ball for just a moment, Aquiles? Like, what is your sense? It sounds like we have a good standing. It sounds like there's a good argument to be made. What is your sense as far as where this is going to go and what sort of timing we should be considering as far as, decisions to be made on whether or not to?
Yeah, that's always the toughest question, right? Because it's kind of like saying, fill out your NCAA bracket and be right in all the games.
This is me putting you on the spot, and I'm going to quote you on it.
Yeah, I know. It's right now what we're looking at. The short term is this big infrastructure proposal, right? Just got an email that next week the Transportation Committee is going to have Buttigieg come and talk about it. So we're going to see some of the Biden priorities spelled out, right? And usually what happens is the White House will put forth their budget. Right? The first year after an election, it's later. Usually it's February. Obviously, this year was a unique year, and it's even later. So everyone's still waiting for the budget proposals of the Biden administration to come out. And in that document, they will have to specify what they want, what they're asking for, and how to pay for it, right? And so then it's kind of like they'll show their cards, in other words, right? And then we can kind of react a little bit. So then we have this infrastructure bill that everyone loves infrastructure, but no one wants to pay for it, right? And so that becomes kind of the big political fight. And of course, infrastructure is in the eye of the beholder, right? So now, infrastructure is a lot of green initiatives. Infrastructure is now including, schools. And you have the Multi-Family Housing Council saying infrastructure includes housing. So, infrastructure becomes kind of everything. right? And so we need to see how this thing unfolds. The indication is that this thing's going to be bigger than the COVID bill. So, they're talking about more than $2 trillion.
Yeah.
1.9 trillion for the latest COVID bill, plus a $2 trillion infrastructure bill. At some point, you have to pay for this stuff, right?
Right.
And I think that's where a lot of the tax proposals may be brought to the fore. On 1031s, I'm still hoping that we can make the argument that it does more harm than good to get rid of 1031s. And I think, again, being optimistic, I think we can convince that. It may end up, there may be other proposals that we lose on, but at least on that one, I'm pretty confident that we could win it. And we fully intend to, deploy all our forces. I think by September, you will probably know whether we're out of the woods on that one or not.
Okay. So, all right. So mark our calendars. Early fall, we're going to have some sort of an indication whether or not we can count on this. Okay.
Yeah, I think, by that time, what procedurally, not to get too into the weeds, they have to come up with a new budget resolution. So we'll know whether they're going to try to make some of these proposals, tax provisions, pay for us for the infrastructure bill, or whether they're just going to say, you know what, we're going to make infrastructure only candy, we're going to borrow it, and then we're going to have a separate tax bill that we're going to try to ram through the Senate. If it's the latter, which we would know at the end of the year, then the fight is on.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate that. And hopefully that gives us a little bit of color. I will say to the audience, if you're hoping for more specifics, if you want to drill down a little bit deeper, throw some questions in the chat. We can continue to focus on the 1031. I know that's a huge item of interest for everybody. But moving the conversation along, I want to jump to you brought up the conversation about infrastructure. Obviously, that feels like a catch-all that could really be, conversational in a variety of directions. But talk to me specifically about infrastructure as it relates to energy efficiency legislation. Obviously, that's a major departure from one administration to the next. I'm curious where NAIOP stands on that and what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, again, so much of this can be brought together that we have infrastructure and energy efficiency as two of our top areas, and they might end up being all implicated in whatever bill moves through, right? So for energy, we have actually been in a pretty good position compared to some other real estate groups, okay? And by that, I mean, when I first got to NAIOP, a big fight broke out over the essentially what we call the Schumer Amendment, which was basically the federal government creating these arbitrary mandates to for energy efficiency by certain dates. So I think at that time it was like, all buildings have to be 30% energy efficient by 2015, and they had these numbers that they essentially just pulled out of the air because they were good politics for them, and so we defeated those, but in the interim, the industry, number one, has been moving in that direction anyway, right? So we've been making a lot of energy efficiency advancements. There's a lot of desire to be on the right side of this issue, I think, both on the industry side and frankly on our side as well. So we've played it fairly positive with the Senate. We've supported updating building codes in frankly, a rational way. Some real estate groups have been just totally opposed, right? Now, with Biden in the White House, some of this stuff is going to really be coming to the fore. So we're in a good position to argue on behalf of that. So within the infrastructure energy debate, we want an incentive for developers who voluntarily, use more energy efficient products in their buildings, whether it's HVAC systems or whatever. Maybe get advanced or accelerated depreciation for those. In other words, we're trying to have a positive message on this, but that is more incentive based as opposed to just, do it become net zero by 2020 or 2030 is what they're talking about now. So I think it's going to be a very active debate. I don't know that Democrats really, one thing is running a campaign and saying you want to do things, and the next is having to tell senators from Montana and West Virginia, like Tester and Manchin, that we're going to destroy your industries. That gets tougher. Even within the Democratic caucus, I think there's some, wariness about this.
And it's curious because obviously NAIOP, and I would say those of us in the industry, though we all have our politics, the conversation today is not to get into the politics so much as to just understand the impact of the politics and of the legislation on our industry. So as businessmen and women, as leaders in the real estate industry, it's understanding where those impacts are. And certainly, using that as a caveat, we can certainly appreciate that, there are existing industries that are impacted by legislation that is happening today, a lot of which are found in those energy, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's renewables. There are a lot of impacts today that are being discussed on the federal level about legislation for coal or oil or gas, or any number of those things. So yes, I think a lot of people would agree that there's a potential negative impact to existing industry, but there's also a potential offset to the positive impact of some of these newer, growing, burgeoning industries that we find in some of the more renewable, less finite industries, right? Like solar and wind and some of those many others. And so I think, again, not trying to put this in a political sphere as much as just understanding where the opportunities are and how the federal regulations are impacting what those opportunities might look like.
Yeah, and you make a good point. And it's like, what we're trying to do is make sure that as the nation moves in this direction, that, we don't get unnecessarily harmed by, frankly, just dumb policies, not well thought out. And you need to have a seat at the table, I think, for them to actually listen, as opposed to just being on the outside, screaming your head off, saying it's not going to work. On some issues, frankly, we're going to have to do that. But on the energy side, I mean, when I look at our NAIOP membership and the major corporations like Prologis, they're leading the way on a lot of sustainability efforts. So I'm not going to be in a position where I'm fighting things that my members already want to do. I just want to make sure that the government doesn't really screw it up.
Yeah. Yes, agreed. And that's probably the best way to put probably all of our interests here, right? Is that not, I don't know, I haven't looked at the participant list. I don't know that we have any, politicians tuning in today, but we do have a lot of interested industry leaders who look, especially with a specific focus on Utah and this market. And so the question really, as it relates to energy and efficiency and what legislation there is, I don't know that the industry really is looking at this like it's one or the other. It's coal or it's solar, it's gas or it's wind. Like, I think it's, for most of us in the industry, it's more or less, where are the opportunities, and is there a way to support both? Because at the end, look, we can't eliminate the idea that solar and wind and many of the renewable options are infinite, number one, and number two, that they're not going away. So, whereas some of the other industries have some limitations, but is there a way that we can support legislation from the private sector that allows for both, that allows for a marriage of, we can't ignore the fact that there is an oil and gas and other industry, right? And that supports a lot of what we're trying to do. But we also can't ignore the fact that, especially like in Utah, solar has a lot of potential here. And there are a lot of renewable energies that really aren't going to go away. That's where we're trending. So how can we continue to push that conversation that recognizes the trends and allows us to have legislation that we as real estate professionals can invest in and see as a way for the future for opportunities.
I'll give you an example just to kind of let people know, some of these things, and this is what angers people, I think, about the business that I'm in, which is advocacy. There are environmental groups that we work with, right? And they're pushing a policy in terms of giving credit to buildings that get their energy from renewable sources like solar, right? Well, that sounds great, right? But what essentially some of their proposals are, they want to penalize buildings that don't. Well, that's not your fault, right? You connect to a grid, so it's not the fault of the building developer or owner that has to deal with the energy grid that is in particular for that area, right? But we want to punish that building owner, and the rationale, frankly, when you get down to it, is they want the building owner to put pressure on people to change the grid. Well, I don't see that as the right way to go, right? And so that's the type of stuff that the details in a lot of these things that people aren't really aware of, and that's important.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, we could talk about that forever, but we are on time, so let's continue moving the conversation. We're getting some questions in before we get too far removed from the capital gains in 1031. One of the questions that came in, I think, is pertinent for you to answer immediately. Maybe is thank you, Kurt, for sending this in. The current administration must understand the impact of the disruptive policies. Would you be able to articulate how the changes to capital gains, 1031, and renewable incentives might be a positive for the industry?
You mean the changes that are being proposed by the Biden administration?
I think
positive?
The way I read this is that there is a potential for disruption, but yes, how the Biden administration disruptions, which they are, could be a positive. And it sounds like Kurt is curious as to what those positive disruptions are.
I don't, that's a tough question for me to answer because I haven't heard any positive thoughts from our members on getting rid of 1031s or increasing capital gains tax rates or any of those things. So, I think that in the past, if you were to make an argument that you were streamlining the tax code or simplifying the tax code and lowering tax rates, then you can make an argument that it's cleaner and it's fairer. But that's not the argument these days. The argument is close all of these, end all these provisions and increase tax rates. I don't know how that helps the industry. I mean, infrastructure and a positive view of moving forward on energy, those are helpful to the industry.
I think and appreciate that, Aquiles, because I know that was kind of putting on the spot there. I think really at the end of the day, it sounds like what Kurt's getting at and what all of us want to know is if current legislation goes through on those, especially on those issues, is there a silver lining? What can we expect that is still a positive, even if it's not the preferred outcome?
Well, if you look at what folks are talking about now, you have projected growth rates of 8% and the same for a couple of years. The Federal Reserve has said they're not going to increase interest rates until 2023. Right? Now, the market may decide otherwise, but an argument could be made that if some of these things get done, regardless of their individual impact, maybe the overall impact is going to be a positive for the economy. And coming out of the pandemic, we're all going to be better off. So in that sense, if I were to just sit here and be philosophical, if Biden ends up creating a bipartisan atmosphere where people get a sense that we're on our way to better policy, then I think that's a positive.
Yeah, agreed. Okay. Question about carried interest. Where does Congress currently stand on that?
There's a lot of folks who follow this issue know the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the tax reform bill that was passed in 2017, limited carried interest. But this was our fallback position, to be very honest. The movement was to tax carried interest or promotes as ordinary income, right? And the push for that really arose from this antipathy toward Wall Street hedge funds and what they were doing in terms of avoiding what people thought was, paying income on their salaries by kind of characterizing it as capital gains. So that was kind of the political push for that. The tax reform bill basically said they put a 3-year holding period on carried interest. So in other words, if you want to be taxed at capital gains, then this asset has to be held for 3 years. I think that's pretty good policy in that you're basically showing that this is really a capital asset, right? It's, most capital gains just to keep it for a year. This one's for 3. So to me, it just buttresses the argument that this is more like a capital asset than not. But that, again, carried interest has become kind of a scalp, kind of a symbolic win. And so Democrats have already, and Bill Pascrell from New Jersey specifically has already introduced bills to get rid of all of carried interest, including real estate. And so they still want that. That one worries me because it's more political than policy, right? It's, we've already kind of addressed the issue from a policy perspective by imposing a 3-year holding period. But the politics is still strong. It's who's going to protect Wall Street, right? And no matter how many times I talk to a reporter, they have their story already written. It's, a loophole for Wall Street hedge funds. And I think that's the one that if I were to advise our members, be careful on that one going forward, because I think that might be one that is tough to defend, particularly in a big bill, like an infrastructure bill with $2 trillion, and you're going to have that as a pay for. Who's going to stand in the way of a $2 trillion infrastructure bill that might have a lot of stuff that your state needs in order to be characterized as protecting hedge funds, right? So that's a tough one.
Right. We've got a question, but yeah, I think it's going to be more encompassed through all. So let me get back to a couple of the other more specific questions, and then we can come back to my thoughts. But how do you see pass-through taxation impacting commercial real estate, and ultimately what can we as an industry expect there?
Yeah, well, one of the proposals is to get rid of the preferential treatment for pass-throughs in the tax code that was the tax reform bill, right? That 20% deduction for qualified business income. And if you work out the math, what that ends up doing is it gives about it establishes about a 29.6% effective tax rate on pass-throughs, right? And remember, the reform bill reduced corporate tax rates from 35 to 21. And when they did that, the fear was that pass-throughs were going to be disadvantaged. And so then they created this thing in order to make it less of an impact upon pass-throughs. So, you got a 29.6 rate for pass-through income, and you have a 21% for corporate income, right? We know corporate tax rates are probably going to move up, right? And so the issue here is, the way I view it is like they should move in tandem, right? So I think there's going to be a move. First of all, Biden wants to get rid of it, right? But again, that could be just an opening bid. I think there will be a move to do that. And so you could see an increase on that front. I haven't heard anyone specifically, other than the extreme progressive wing, I haven't heard anyone specifically targeting that, again, other than the extreme progressive wing. I haven't heard necessarily people on the Senate Finance Committee identifying that, but we know there's going to be movement on that. And how it affects real estate, half of business income in the US is pass-through income. And a huge chunk of that is real estate industry. So it is going to have an impact.
Yeah, we're so I got to tell you, my phone is just lighting up. I'm getting a lot of text messages. We have a very enthusiastic real estate industry here in Utah, and they're very aware of the fact that we in Utah are, and you and I talked about this, Aquiles, earlier, but we're very aware of the fact that we are positioned very favorably. We were pre-COVID, but even more so, I think, post-COVID, from a real estate and from a landlord perspective in a variety of product types. And a lot of, the real estate industry is especially interested in a number of these things that we're talking about, but I'm getting a lot of texts about opportunity zones, what changes are being considered, what does that look like, and whether or not you can speak to that from a federal level.
Yeah, well, from an investment standpoint, I gather, if people are investing in an opportunity zone in part to avoid paying capital gains taxes now, does it really make sense if you're going to pay higher capital gains taxes down the line, right? So that's one consideration. But some of the things that I worry about, opportunity zones, the New York Times during the campaign and several other newspapers immediately started pointing out that Gerald Kushner and real estate developers are benefiting from opportunity zones. And of course, during the time of Trump, being a real estate developer was a bad thing, right? In their eyes. So there's some talk among folks in Congress that they want to limit how much real estate investment actually can qualify for opportunity zone benefits. I don't know that goes anywhere, but it's out there. And so, it's not just legislation. We need to keep an eye on regulations and what the IRS does. So that's, it's an area that right now there's nothing concrete proposed, but an area that I'm keeping an eye on.
Okay, appreciate that. And I think there's there are going to be a lot of eyes on what happens over the next, call it, couple of months, couple of years, on the discussion of opportunity zones and what that looks like. Particularly, I think, again, from this localized standpoint, we see a lot of local interest, but also a lot of out of market interest in investment here in Salt Lake and the greater Salt Lake community in Utah, what that looks like. And so, I think all of these things really kind of impact what, at the end of the day, is going to be that continued interest. And so, speaking from somebody here locally, we're really investing in that continued promise of what this economy here locally looks like. And every one of these issues that you're talking about really impacts what we're seeing here in Utah. So a couple of questions from the chat. Rhonda, I've got a question you addressed to me. I don't know if you want the answer from me, which could be much less educated and less eloquent than Aquiles, but I'm going to throw it to Aquiles and see what his thoughts are. Can you prioritize solar, wind, hydrogen, clean coal, et cetera, as the better choice for real estate users and also for the state of Utah, or no? Just kind of your thoughts on what that looks like.
Solar and wind, I think, you can't go wrong, I think, if you actually have that, because I don't know how much it will help in terms of our issues. Like I said, people still want us to push other industries in that direction, and we're limited in what we can do. But I think clearly, if you can maximize solar and wind, you're probably helping yourself not only at the federal level, but also, I would think, locally, right? I deal a lot with our Denver chapter, and they're they're the folks running the energy initiatives for the city of Denver came from Seattle, and they come with a Seattle mindset, and so this stuff is being replicated in a lot of areas. And I think the more you can move toward renewables, the better it is for the industry.
It feels like, and tell me if you think otherwise, Aquiles, but it feels like that it's always a debate that's couched in either or, black or white, right? And though I think that it's clear where the industry is headed, where the trends are moving, it feels like it's politically divisive because of politics. And so you're either coal, oil, gas, petroleum, or your solar, wind, energy storage, renewables. And obviously there are some ideological differences, but at the end of the day, as developers, as builders, as designers, as investors in the real estate industry, to me, if we can remove the politics for a second and just think, number one, what's good for the economy, but also number two, good for the economy also means referencing what has consistently been in the past good for the economy, which means recognizing what are existing industries. And so I guess the point that I want to make in reaction to Rhonda's question really is that it feels like there's a balance, and it's not there's a clean cut line between where we stop relying on fossil fuels and start relying on renewables, but there's a transition, right? And that could be a long transition, but from a NAIOP industry standpoint, I think the question is whether or not, can we both continue to honor, some of the industries that are existing for what they represent, but also invest in, some of these renewable and progressive industries. What does that look like in Utah? Now I'm speaking specifically less from, and apologize, sort of, because I'm going to put on my day job hat, which is with Mortensen, and we are heavily invested in a number of the renewable industries, including wind and solar and a few others. Utah is really well positioned from a renewable standpoint, especially on the solar side, because we're high altitude, because we have a lot of unused real estate, because we have, a number of boxes that we can check that really speak to what wants to be utility grade, large scale solar use. It feels like an industry that our development and real estate community really can invest in, but the huge asterisk there is, yes, the industry is moving that way. Yes, it's the right thing to do for the environment and probably the economy, but where's the support and or guidance from federal legislation? And I think that's really where we're.
I think, you've touched upon energy is a really complex area. And I don't know if, there's a great book called Superpower, which is about wind power. You should read it. It's great. It just shows how wind power can produce a lot of the energy we need, but there are a lot of barriers, and we saw what happened in Texas, right? You got to do it right. They did not invest in wind power mechanisms that could withstand the cold. Minnesota does. They didn't have a problem, right? But
Right.
So there's the cost issue, and so you have the various energy industries. You also have something that, in politics, unlike business, where people can kind of agree and move forward, our political system no longer, what I would characterize, does not compromise between competing goals all that well anymore, right? So, for example, when I was in the Bush White House and Domestic Policy Council, they wanted to pass regulations that would allow coal-fired power plants to upgrade and become cleaner, right? So you would think, well, that's a good thing, right? But for people who wanted the end of coal power plants, no amount of fixing would work. And so we were always hampered. We could not make things cleaner because folks wanted, it was an all or nothing approach. They wanted complete win on that. And you see the same thing happening, I think, in the energy debate. We could move. We all know we could do a little bit more solar, a little bit more energy, but we're not going to get off of oil completely. But there's some who want us to just get off of oil completely now.
Yeah.
That comes up the legislative work. So, and then you got folks like Manchin, who has half of his state employed by the coal industry. You get elected to represent your people.
Yeah. No, I think it's fair, and you and I could probably opine on that for many hours, really. And personal politics aside, I think you're right. There's always a happy medium somewhere. But short of that, we are getting short on time. I have one more question for you that's coming from the larger group, and that is they're curious about your thoughts on what will happen when the freeze on evictions and mortgage forbearance ends.
I know that Multifamily Housing Council has been a big, proponent of getting rid of that. We have actually helped some chapters deal with state efforts to impose these things. There was I think in Hawaii, there was actually efforts to, it was a mess. Basically, tenants would have, almost total ability to not get evicted and not pay rent. So, we've had these issues that we fought. I think as the pandemic recedes, hopefully, again, knock on wood, that the push for that's going to lessen, particularly since a lot of government assistance has already gone to folks in that situation. There'll be voices that, tenant voices that want to continue it, but I think things are moving away from that.
That's fair. Okay. Last couple of minutes. I'm not going to rapid fire you with all the texts that I'm getting because there are too many. But what I will say is, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, Jade, so get ready. First of all, thank you for your time today. It's good, first of all, to hear from you, but also to have somebody, not that you're an elected representative, but somebody, look, at the end of the day, we're all business people and we're all in the private sector for a variety of reasons, but I would say propose first and foremost because we don't want to be in the public sector. And though you're not in the public sector, you are that conduit for us to understand what's happening in that sector and appreciate the thoughts you have and educating us to understand as business people what the impacts from legislation look like. So thank you for that and for the conversation today. Tell me if there's anything that we as a private sector industry, business leaders, men and women in a variety of disciplines can do to help inform the continued conversation with the public sector and with our legislators. What does that look like? What can we continue to do from a NAIOP audience?
I think, a lot of the stuff that you normally do on a day-to-day basis, all of our NAIOP members have a persona, a corporate persona that they have to defend, an image, whether it's being a lead on sustainability efforts or creating jobs and opportunity zones. All that stuff that you do is great. And, my challenge sometimes is knowing how much great stuff you guys are doing so that I can then take it to the Hill. Because again, unfortunately, our politics has become something where it's easy to demonize, right? Yeah. And guess what? Somebody who's the president comes from the real estate industry, let's demonize real estate. If it's oil, it's demonize oil. So I think, it's nothing specific necessarily. I mean, obviously when issues come up and if there's a particular elected official from Utah that we need you to reach out to, you'll hear from me. But otherwise, it's just, doing the good work that you guys do and getting known for it.
So turning it back to the audience, then what I'm hearing from Aquiles is continue to kick ass at your jobs, guys. Like we're in a really great position in Utah. We're doing a lot of really fantastic things. Salt Lake City is primed and positioned for some fantastic development and growth over the next few years, particularly coming out of COVID. I know I don't have to sell Utah to anybody in this audience, but at the end of the day, keep doing what you're doing because ultimately that's going to be the best way that we can influence what is happening on a legislative, especially federal level, but even on the state legislative level. Just continue doing what you're doing. So Aquiles, thank you for your time today. Much appreciated. Hopefully it was as informative to the group as it was to me.